Well, hi class. This is my mini lecture on Chapter 3 on ecosystems. Again, I'm just going to go over some of the highlights of things that I think are of importance for you to concentrate on when looking at the chapter. It starts out by looking at basically what keeps us and other organisms alive, and it talks about the three main areas we divide the Earth and the area around the Earth into. The first being the atmosphere, which is, of course, the air, the area above the landforms. And then there's the hydrosphere, which is the water part of the planet. Again, streams, rivers, oceans, underground aquifers, any place where there's water. And then, of course, the biosphere, and that's the area where organisms can live. And remember, the biosphere can be anywhere from really very deep in the ocean, where we now know that many organisms live, to high in the atmosphere. Let's say as high as birds would fly, or tops of mountains where things would live. And so when we look at environmental issues, we look at how they affect all three of those areas. As well as the actual, what they call the geosphere, or really the land area. And that is, the mountains, the surface of the Earth. And, it goes into more detail on looking at the crust and the mantle and so forth, and you can take a look at that. But again, we're interested in how these major areas of the planet are being affected by various environmental issues like air pollution, water pollution, let's say development of sensitive areas like wetlands and things like that. Okay. It talks about the three factors that sustain life on Earth. One of them, these are really sort of an offshoot of what we discussed about of the principles of sustainability, though there's just basically the most one in common is that there's a cycling of nutrients, which we talked about was one of the principles of sustainability. And that's obviously important for keeping life going because, as I said, we only have a certain amount of matter on the Earth. And so if we have generation after generation of people and other organisms, we have to somehow recycle all those chemicals to make them available for the next generation. The next is the one-way flow of high-quality energy from the sun basically through plants for the most part, that then provides, the food and energy for the rest of all the organisms to live. Of course, there are some microorganisms organisms that have chemosynthesis. They don't need light. They can synthesize, through use of various chemicals in the environment and produce what they need to live. And then the last one is kind of obvious, but it's gravity, and that's what keeps us firmly planted on terra firma. And what allows us to have an atmosphere that keeps an atmosphere, and which allows us, of course, to be alive. Okay, a little bit on climate there. I'm not going to worry so much about that. Then we get into one of the really most important part of this chapter is learning the various components of the ecosystem. And it starts out, giving you a chart that shows you everything from the atom up to the whole biosphere of every living thing on the planet. I want to concentrate, just talk a little bit about, from the organism level up. And the organism, of course, is an individual organism. Let's say a deer living in your backyard. Then there's a population, which is a group of individuals of the same species, so maybe that herd of deer. And then you have a community, which is a grouping of all different species that live in a particular area. And then sort of another step up from that is the ecosystem, which is all the plants and animals living in an area, but also their interactions between them. And not only interactions between the living aspects of an area, but the non-living as well. So they interact with climate, with rainfall and so forth. They interact with water sources. They interact with the various topography, whether it's flat or hilly and so on and so forth, affects which animals will live where and also how they interact. Then there are ways of looking at how energy flows through an ecosystem. And the way that energy flows through an ecosystem, we basically call the trophic levels. And the trophic levels start down at the producers, which are the plants. After all, who produces, the foodstuffs initially for everyone on the planet? For the most part, it's plants called autotrophs. Autotroph means self-feeders because they can use the sunlight through photosynthesis to produce sugar and basically to feed themselves. From the autotrophs or the producers, we then have consumers, and there are a couple of different types of consumers. First, we have the heterotrophs or the plant eaters, and these are basically primary consumers. Herbivores, which are the plant eaters, and herbivores basically are. Well, think of the deer as an example of eating plants and getting most all its nutrients that it needs, pretty much everything from plant material. Then we have carnivores, of course, like us, or lions, tigers, and bears, though bears are, though many of us are omnivores in terms of, let's say, like raccoons or human beings or bears, which will eat both vegetation and will eat meat as well. So we have those herbivores eating plants, we have carnivores eating just meat, and then we have omnivores that eat a variety of foods. Now humans are omnivores, but of course we have the brain power. We can decide not to be omnivores, to just be vegetarians, let's say, or vegans. And I guess you could also decide the other way, to just eat meat, but I don't think that would be very healthy for you. But we do have that ability. Most animals do not have that ability to willfully change their diet so dramatically. They would change it depending on what's available to eat, of course. And so if you are an omnivore, you have a wider choice of things to eat. So you maybe have a better chance of survival at times. If one food source is gone, you can eat something else. And so we also have, remember, we have the producers. The next level up would be the primary consumers. So these are the things that eat the plants. They eat the plants directly, so a deer. And then we have the secondary consumers. Let's say a cougar that eats the deer. So we have, primary, secondary. We even have tertiary, if there's something else that ate the cougar. In this case, probably not very much, but you could have three levels, and the third level could very well be man. So, from the producers, the fourth level would be, because it would be producers, primary consumers, secondary consumers, and you could have tertiary consumers as well, depending on how far up the food chain or food web we go. And another important aspect of ecosystems, important member, which we shouldn't forget, though it's not as exciting as the other ones like lions, tigers, and bears, are the decomposers. Because after all, if things did not die, there would be no life. So things have to die, and their chemicals have to be recycled into the planet again. And that's where the decomposing organisms come into effect. We have some things, some birds, for instance, that directly eat dead animals, but we're mainly talking about bacteria and so forth that break down vegetation or animals that have died, and incorporate those nutrients back into the soil and so forth, and allow us to cycle those nutrients and continue life on planet Earth. Okay. In terms of those trophic levels, and continuing our discussion of what happens with energy flow in an ecosystem, we often will look at who eats who as a way to see how the energy flows in an ecosystem. And we used to basically call this a food chain. And they were fairly simple. It could be grass, deer, cougar. But we've known for a long time, really, that things aren't that simple. And that the reality out in the real world, it's more like a very complex set of chains, of food chains. And now we call it the food web. And there are examples in your book that show you a food chain and food web. So take a look at that. The one that shows you one that takes place in the ocean. And you can see there's quite a few interactions. You know, this animal eats this, which is then eaten by this, and maybe it's eaten by this. And it's not just a straight line chain that, you know, we use to simplify this concept. It's really much more complex out in the real world. And there's also a chart, this is chart 312, that shows you the various trophic levels. So again, they show you the producers being the plants, being the first trophic level, the second being a caterpillar that eats the plants, the third trophic level being a secondary consumer, or let's say a robin, a bird that eats the worm, and then maybe the fourth trophic level in this case being the top carnivore, usually maybe a hawk or another predator bird. Now, one thing we need to be careful about is that as you go up these trophic levels, numbers tend to go down, because you need, you know, a lot of things at the first and second level, and even the third, to support even a few individuals at the fourth level. So the top carnivores usually are most threatened when it comes to extinction and being threatened with their existence. Because there just are less of them. Like if you look at the case where there may be hundreds of thousands of deer in a certain area, well, that will support only a certain number of wolves. I mean, maybe it would be 100 or maybe a couple of hundred. And when we start doing away with that top predator, which we have done in this country, we'll talk more about that in later chapters, but when we start killing those predators like the cougars and the wolves, we tend to see an explosion at levels below, because, as you know, there's an interaction there. One is a predator and one is prey. And when we step in and think we can do something better than Mother Nature does it, we're often causing problems that end up in a, not in disturbing equilibrium, and causing, let's say, overpopulation of deer that then may starve to death. And then there may be, let's say, overgrowth of forests from lack of deer. And maybe that leads, eventually to maybe fire, which is an important ecological event as well. Even though, and the humans have finally gotten to the point where we tend not to always put fires out in the natural areas, because we realize that they play an important role ecologically, and we'll learn more about that in later chapters, of course, too. I also want you to look on page 65. Is the idea of an energy pyramid. And it shows you basically that, it goes by the rule of 10. Now, this is not exactly correct. Of course, nothing is exactly correct in nature. There always are variations. But basically, as you go up a trophic level, you lose 90% of the energy. So, for instance, it shows you that 10,000 phytoplankton can support 1,000 zooplankton, which can support 100 perch or fish, which can support 10 humans. In other words, as you go up the trophic levels, you only move up 10% of the available energy. Now, this is a major concept that supports the idea that maybe we should all be vegetarians. If you eat closer to the lower trophic levels, you're not losing as much energy. And so if for instance, if you need a 1,000 pounds of grass to produce, 100 pounds of cow, which then, leads to, 10 pounds in a human, again, you're losing 90%, and you're passing on about 10% of that energy that's available. So if you eat closer to the lower trophic levels, let's say as a vegetarian does, we don't waste that energy by processing it through an intermediary like a cow. And so, one way to feed more people may be for more people to be vegetarians. It's probably not the solution that's going to help us out, but it's easy to look at that and see that via the pyramid of energy. And eating at lower trophic levels means there's more food available for more organisms. Okay. Now, the book goes into various cycles. I'm not going to really go into that very much. It's fairly straightforward. A couple of really important cycles I want to mention, of course, are the water cycle, How does water get, through evaporation, transpiration, it goes up into the atmosphere, and it comes back down as rain, sleet, snow, hail, so on and so forth. Where it comes down is extremely important, as you know from being in California. Most of the population lives in Southern California. Most of the rainfall falls in Northern California, and this has caused everything from just about wars to political fights to down to the present day. And we're still talking now about a new plan to deal with the Sacramento Delta to get more water to flow down south, because those folks down in Southern California want to suck us dry up north and take all our water. And I'm not sure that's right, but we've, of course, have already built pipelines to support agriculture in the valleys in Central California and Southern California, and of course to support the populations in Los Angeles and in San Diego. And we also have a pipeline coming from the Colorado River, of course, from the east that supports population in California as well. And years ago, an important court case won by Arizona and Colorado allowed them to reduce the amount of water that's taken out of the Colorado. The Colorado used to flow, as a tremendous river all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico, and now it's barely a trickle. Because we take out so much water before it ever reaches the Gulf of Mexico. So water issues are major issues, not only in California. I've lived in Colorado where there were major issues and had droughts and dried up wells, and some people think that water would be the cause of the next series of wars we may have down the road. And we're already starting to see this a bit. I've worked in the Middle East a little bit, and to see the potential battles over water there, because it's a desert area, of course, so it exacerbates the problem. We may have wars, based on resources as opposed to, religion or economics or, political battles and so on and so forth. So the hydrosphere and the water cycle, very, very important. Next is the next more important one I think to look at is the carbon cycle. And this is very important because it's the key to understanding climate change and global warming. The whole idea of trapping carbon, in the atmosphere in the form of carbon dioxide. And it's also important from a pollution point of view because of carbon monoxide, which is an exhaust from burning fossil fuels. Already burning, really. I mean, burning wood and so on and so forth. And as you know, carbon monoxide is very poisonous. That's why you have carbon monoxide detectors in your house. There are people every year who die in wintertime from having faulty heaters that produce too much carbon monoxide, and people end up basically sleeping and then going, unconscious and then eventually dying if not found soon enough. So carbon monoxide is one of the pollutants that is regulated under the Clean Air Act, and so we try to regulate the amount of carbon monoxide. Carbon dioxide helps trap the heat in the planet Earth, and it's very handy because without global warming, there would be no life on Earth at all. We need the atmosphere to trap heat, because if all of the sun's energy that hit the Earth bounced back out, we would be a very cold planet with no atmosphere, and we would have little, if any, chance of having life here. So we do need that to happen. The only question is, has our development activities, our industrialization, and increasing use of tremendous amounts of fossil fuels put so much carbon into the atmosphere, as well as other chemicals that also lead to climate change as well, and to global warming. We put so much carbon in the atmosphere due to man-made activities that we're, disrupting the shift, and we are going towards having a warmer and warmer climate. And of course, we'll have a chapter on greenhouse gases and climate change, and so we'll take a further look at it then. Of course, the nitrogen cycle is very important. Plants need nitrogen in certain forms to grow, and so we have nitrogen fertilizers. And then there's also the phosphorus and the sulfur cycle. Take a quick look at those and see how those cycle through the ecosystem as well. Now, these concepts that we're learning in this chapter, I think you'll be able to apply, to just about everything else we'll study in the class. along with, a little bit of the laws of thermodynamics and the scientific method, and a couple of things that we've learned. So these 3 chapters, I look at as the basis for now studying the rest of the book and the rest of the class as well. These are sort of your foundation principles. And understanding these ecological principles are very important. So please concentrate on that. Find out where you are on the trophic level. You're probably mostly all the same level, except for those who are, vegetarians, which are, at a slightly different level than those of us who consume meat. So I was a vegetarian for a number of years and was sort of forced to change when I went into the Peace Corps years ago and went down to Paraguay to serve in the Peace Corps and had no choice over my diet down there. Very few fresh vegetables available at all, and ended up eating, meat again. And when meat got expensive, I learned that we were being fed horse meat, which I don't like at all. But then again, I've a few years ago, I visited Switzerland, and on the menu in many restaurants there is horse meat. So they look at things quite differently than we do here. So I don't know what trophic level I was on then, but I wasn't on a happy one. So anyway, I'll leave you now. So study the concepts in chapter 3, and I'll see you next in our mini lecture on chapter 4, which will start getting into biodiversity and the concept of evolution. Okay, folks, take care.